Okay, good evening, everybody. So today what we'll be doing is talking about 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 through 20. But before we get into the passage, I want to consider the setting to give us an understanding of what happens in this chapter. So in the previous chapter, in chapter 4, what Paul does is that he argues that though believers are part of the church, which has the truth, as time goes on, some will depart from the faith by prompting false doctrines. And so Timothy is to warn believers about false doctrines, which he emphasizes in chapter 4, and teach sound doctrine, and encourages Timothy to be an example. So Paul tells Timothy to attend readings, exhortations, and teaching the scripture. So once Paul finishes encouraging Timothy on how to be an example, he instructs him on how to treat people in the church, and that is what we see in chapter 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to read 1 Timothy 5, verse 17 through 20. So it says, elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially who work hard at both preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. And in another place, those who work deserve their pay. Do not listen to an accusation against an elder unless it is confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who sin should be reprimanded in front of the whole church. This will serve as a strong warning to others. So since we're looking at these 3 verses, I'd like to start with an overview of what happens in chapter 5. So it begins on how to correct older men, younger men, older women, and younger women, according to their age and honor. Then what about widows? He also talks about widows. Children and grandchildren have the responsibility to take care of the widows ages 60 and over. And they may also be supported by the church, which he mentions. Younger widows should marry or be supported by a related woman believer. The church elders who do a good job of leading the church deserve to be paid well, especially those who work hard at teaching and preaching, and be careful about any accusations made against these elders. And do not appoint men to the ministry that are not ready. So in a sense, though, that last point is what verses 17 through 20 are kind of talking about. But then the question becomes, how is this relatable? So the emphasis here is that leaders can make or break a church. What makes leadership so solemn a responsibility? One part of the answer is implicit to this passage. The importance of church community trust in its leadership. A member's mistake may affect only the member, but a leader's mistake affects the whole congregation. But if a church is to continue to exist and to carry out its God-given task, it must support and trust its leaders. For God has ordained that the fellowship of believers be led by people called to that task. And so the emphasis in these 3 verses is that the faithful elders, in our case the pastor, needs to be distinguished from the unfaithful. The unfaithful needed to be disciplined, but in fairness, which talks about in verse 19. And some leadership has to be replaced, which is talked about in verse 20. So first note that it's in the elders, or in our case our pastor, who directs the affairs of the church. They have the God-given responsibility for leadership and guidance of the church. Paul says that those who do so well, and especially those who labor in preaching and teaching, are worthy of double honor. Now, this is weird. Why double honor? What does it refer to when he says double honor? So a pastor is a suitable teacher. That is how a pastor leads a congregation. The scripture said the direction of life, and unless a pastor is preaching or teaching from scripture, in our case, she's not doing any leading. That is what constitutes the work of our pastor. So all pastors are to teach and preach. And some labor in this. Some spend long hours to extensive preparation, and they teach often. They hardly have time left to earn a living in other ways. And the apostle says that those who labor in preaching and teaching, who have the skills, the gifts, and the abilities to do this, are the ones to be given double honor. So honor in the sense of respect, which is to be given to all elders, and in our case to our pastor. But double honor has a double meaning, right? It's not just respect, but it's also talking about payment. As verse 17 says, also are paid well. So they are to be paid. Their needs, expenses, their salaries are to be paid in order to free them to do the work of preaching and teaching, because it takes time. It's a lot of work. So there's a basis for pastors' salaries. If they're occupied fully in this work of teaching and preaching the scripture, so that the people understand them, then they are to be given this double honor. So verse 18, Paul uses scripture to back up his claim that the elders are worthy of double honor. Now he does references to Old Testament texts. The Israelites were instructed by the Lord not to muzzle their oxen while they are treating the grain. They were to allow the ox to eat of the grain they were treading. So what it's saying is that the pastor is devoting his full-time ministry or her full-time ministry to preaching and teaching the word, and they're worthy to derive their support by doing so. And in addition to that, when we see verse 19, talks about Paul instructing Timothy concerning the double honor due to the others who do well. But what about those that don't? And so he mentions the idea of false accusations. So in addition to respecting our elders and paying them well, we also need to be careful when someone says that they have an accusation against the pastor, right, in our case, that we need to make sure that it's not just them that are saying it, but that they also have witnesses, in a sense, to support and protect our pastors. So, once again, how is this relatable? Well, this month actually is Clergy Appreciation Month, right? It's the time of the year where we appreciate our pastors. We appreciate the work that they're doing for us. And in a sense, we show them, or we give them back. We respect them. We show them gratitude for the work that they put in, the extensive hours of teaching us, guiding us, giving us spiritual growth. And in a sense, it's relatable because, for example, in our church, we're doing the Bristol board, right? Where each one of us, each of our youth, is showing them by a short letter how they appreciate them. So in a sense, what Timothy emphasizes is that in order to have a healthy congregation, in order to have a healthy church, we need to start at the top. We need to take care of our pastors, take care of our elders, in order for our congregation to remain healthy. So it's important to remember the work that they put in for us to learn and grow. And being a pastor isn't easy, even though none of us are a pastor, right? But we get to see it because they're not just preaching and teaching, right? They're also running the church. And there's different areas and there's different aspects of the church that they have to run as well. So it's also important to consider that and take that into consideration.